Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I've got a short video. It's another movie sort of review reaction video, and this one is to the Disney Plus documentary Stan Lee about Stan Lee, in the words of Stan Lee. Now, I wanted to talk about this specifically because it's interesting, but also because I've seen a lot of chatter online about it. Specifically, the Jack Kirby estate. Jack Kirby's son Neil Kirby put out a big statement about it, and it's reignited the talk about who should get credit and Stan stealing credit, and well, I'll get into that in a minute because I find that to be the most tedious discussion in comics. It's full stop. I just can't stand it. But there's a more interesting discussion that I haven't seen nearly as much of, which is just about how the documentaries are done, the voice of the documentarian, and what they choose to show and what they choose not to show, how they edit it. It shapes the story. They craft the story they want to tell with this, and whether the big issue here is whether Disney had a responsibility to make the documentary in a different way, because I'd love to see a totally different Stan Lee documentary. And here's why. Here's what's both good and extremely problematic about the Stan Lee documentary, and that is that the entire documentary, the whole thing, start to finish, it is all primary source audio of Stan himself talking. Sometimes they have the video as well of him being interviewed and talking. Other times it's audio clips. But they basically start with him, talking about his childhood, and they have him talking through his whole life and career, from when he was born up until the end with his Marvel movie cameos. And so what's really good about this sort of documentary is we get to hear Stan himself tell you everything. So it's 100% from Stan's point of view, in Stan's own words, and you can sort of get everything straight from the horse's mouth and judge everything for yourself. And that's also the problem with the documentary, is that it's all from Stan's point of view. It's only Stan talking about everything, and it's just 100% Stan's viewpoint on everything, right? And for people like me and people like most of you that are probably, old school comic fans, that's fine. Because I have been listening to people have this debate about who should get the credit and whether Stan's stealing the credit. I've been listening to the same debate since I got into comics 39 years ago. I've heard it a million times, so I've done a lot of research on it. I've read all the stuff. I've heard all the different angles. So I know when I watch this documentary to take it for what it is, which is it's Stan Lee creating. He's a storyteller, and he's telling the story that he thinks is the best story, right? And that does not necessarily mean it's the true story, and it definitely doesn't mean it's the same viewpoint that other people would have. As I was watching the documentary, I was watching with my wife, and there's a few different times where I basically was like, we got to take this with a grain of salt, because what he just said is heavily debated, and there's very, very different viewpoints if you ask other people that were involved in the process. But the main thing that I said to my wife while we were watching was that the worst thing about the documentary was that I'm going to have to listen to all the fanboys have the same argument about Stan versus Jack again. And sure enough, within the next couple days of that coming out, Facebook, all the different comic forums, like everywhere that I'm online at, is all the same people having the same argument about Stan versus Jack, and it just drives me crazy. And I get it, but man, I just can't stand hearing that conversation again, because I've heard it so many times. I get all the arguments, I get all the viewpoints, I get everyone's passionate about it. I understand why. I'm not saying it's wrong to be passionate about it, but I don't need to hear about it anymore, because I don't think anyone who's been having this debate since the early 80s has made up their mind. They're not going to be swayed by hearing these same arguments and having the same argument over and over again. It just is so tedious for me. So I'm not going to get into it here. But there were places, for those who do know the story, I mean, there's places in the documentary, if you're just watching and listening and paying attention, where Stan, like specifically when he's talking about the creation of Spider-Man, at one point in the documentary, he gives a version of how it came about. And then they go on to something else. When they come back to talk about Spider-Man again, he tells, again, the creation of Spider-Man, and it's a completely different story than before. So, if you're just paying attention, you can see the contradictions and stuff, and that's just all part of it. The problem is that because there's no other voices other than Stan's, there's nobody in the documentary itself to say, hey, point out, hey, he just contradicted himself. There's no critical look at anything he's saying. And the reason that becomes a problem is because a lot of the people that are watching this on Disney Plus, who are the target audience, who are not you and me, who are not hardcore comic fans, but are fans of Stan Lee because of the cameos in the movies, they're not going to know any of the context. They're not going to know the counter arguments. They're not going to have the context to be able to just listen to everything that Stan's saying and just take it for what it is, because they have no reason not to assume and believe that everything Stan is saying is 100% correct. And so that's where I think the real issue is that the documentary felt to me, and I liked it because I love Stan Lee, but by making the choice to create that documentary and specifically not include any of the experts or any of the other voices or anybody else, they didn't talk to, there's no other voices in it. They don't talk to Neil Kirby. They don't talk to the Ditko estate. They don't talk to Jonathan Ross, who, did the documentary In Search of Steve Ditko, and since this documentary has come out, has, publicly gone on the record sort of wagging his finger at Marvel for this. Like, the people that are watching this on Disney Plus who are just fans of the movie are not going to have any context for anything. And so it felt to me, obviously it's an intentional choice by Marvel to do that, or by Disney to do that. And it felt kind of self-serving because it serves Disney and the Marvel cinematic universe. It serves their purposes to put Stan Lee on a pedestal and to promote that version of events. Not only because Stan is sort of the face of the company, it's the sort of mythology building that Disney has 100 years of experience with from Walt Disney. It very much feels like that sort of mythologizing Stan and sort of trying to turn him even more into this icon. But it also serves them because they're in the middle of all of these different, lawsuits and things from different artists and different estates. And so it serves sort of a double purpose as also a sort of PR to get out ahead, because the people watching this are not going to know anything about, the Steve Ditko estates, attempts to take their copyright back or whatever. And so when they do, if they ever hear about that, they're going to be like, oh, that's crap, because I saw that Stan Lee documentary and I heard from Stan Lee that Stan Lee created everything. So it felt very self-serving. And again, this is not against Stan, because Stan doesn't have anything to do with this documentary. He didn't make this. But it felt very self-serving for Marvel and for Disney to exclude those voices and promote this version of events, to promote Stan's version of events, a version of events that I don't think Stan Lee necessarily towards the end felt the need to promote or to even to defend necessarily. Like, when I saw things with Stan Lee the last 10 or 15 years of his life when he was talking about the comics, it seemed much more conciliatory and sort of like, oh, we've got to make sure we include these other people and stuff like that. And there was some of that in the documentary, but again, what I really would have liked to see would have been a documentary where we have critics. And I'm not saying people that are critical of Stan Lee, but people who are educated historians about comics history who are casting a critical eye and responding to what Stan Lee is saying. Either for or against or neutral or whatever. I would like to see some kind of expert opinion to sort of give the context for the viewer. So I think the main issue with this documentary is that there is not another documentary that does that, because it is valuable and interesting and cool to hear Stan Lee himself talk about all this stuff, but you almost need a companion piece, you know, from Ken Burns to basically be like, here's, you know, now that we've got everything that Stan Lee has said, here's a more objective sort of view of everything. And I think that would be super interesting, but I don't think we're ever getting that from Disney or from Marvel. And so that was my issue with the documentary. It wasn't the Stan versus Jack stuff. Again, I don't want to get into any of that. I hate that argument. Don't even want to talk about it. I'm not even going to address it. But even though I don't want to address it, the documentary should have addressed it more. The only thing they had in there, they did have the audio of the infamous radio show where Jack Kirby was a guest and Stan Lee called in, and then they got into an argument about who did what live on the radio. And I think that was in the mid 80s. I had heard about that, but I had never actually heard the audio. So that was really interesting, but that's about the only time that we really get anything in the documentary that sort of challenges anything, is that brief time where we hear Jack Kirby's voice because he's talking to Stan and having the argument. That's the only time where anybody is challenging anything, and I wish we had a lot more of that. There needs to be some context for it to be a fully rounded documentary. So, yeah, for what it is, and for those of us who are, you know, have educated ourselves about this topic, for better or worse, for the past 40 years, it's really interesting to hear Stan's own comments on it. But for the people at large, I think it's doing a disservice to the fans to not present this, because you're kind of pushing an agenda that suits Disney as they work to turn Stan into the next Walt Disney, you know. So yeah, a lot of mixed feelings. If you're a fan of Stan Lee, you'll definitely find it interesting and fun to watch. But it's just there was a lot of intentional omissions just by deciding to only have Stan be the only voice in it. So let me know what you think down below. But I am not going to argue with anybody about who did what. But if you want to argue with each other, go ahead. It's the internet. Just put your comments down below and let me know what you think. If you've seen the documentary, let me know what you think. I'm curious for other thoughts, and I'll see you next time.